The talk today has two parts. The first part is purely therapeutic. The aim of the second part is to put Jungian psychology on an empirical basis. There's actually three ways I found of doing that, but I will just be concentrating on one of those, which is the pregnancy process. So for the first part, which is the therapeutic part, what I'm suggesting that just as there is a corporeal or a physiological pattern in the pregnancy process, in the same way there should be a pattern in the dream symbols that the pregnant woman experiences while she's pregnant, then through lactation, weaning, and post-weaning. So once the weaning is finished, you have a change in the bone metabolism, which goes back to a normal bone metabolism. But I'll get back to that as we go along. So the reason why I think that there will be this kind of pattern in both aspects, if you like, the inner aspect, the dreams or the dream themes, and the outer aspect, the bodily changes that a pregnant woman goes through, is because of this basic idea in Jungian psychology that instinct equals archetype. So instinct is that kind of behaviour or pattern of acting which is not conscious, but which you suddenly jump into when you do without thinking. And I think it's fair enough to say that's common between the rest of the animal kingdom and humans as well. Archetype is the idea that there's a kind of numinous experience, or a, if you like, inverted commas, religious experience, something that takes you over. So what Jung is saying, in saying instinct equals archetype, is this: you've got the same pattern of behaviour. From the outside we observe it biologically, we call it instinct. From within, for the experiencing subject, not the observer from without, it's experienced as something that takes you over from within. So it's almost like working backwards. You sort of say, if this instinct equals archetype idea holds true, then there ought to be, if you put the instinctual, sort of map out the instinctual changes or bodily changes, there ought to be symbolic changes or dream theme changes that correspond to each stage of the pregnancy, lactation, weaning, and post-weaning. So, so in order to complete this first part of the paper, what I've been lucky enough to already start with a friend of mine, Curly, who's writing down her dreams during the pregnancy, to see if this hypothesis can be actually shown, that there are in fact dream symbol changes, or the symbolism of the dreams at a particular time when there's a physiological change, and can we point to any kind of correspondence between the two? Now obviously sample of one isn't quite big enough, so we'll need a certain number. I think 60 was the number that's proposed for a pilot study. So eventually be looking at seeing about getting some number like that of pregnant women who'd be interested in writing down their dreams, and you can start to put it on a more solid basis, the greater number of women who'd be willing to participate in that. Now, if and when that pattern emerges, sort of corresponding from the physical changes to the dream symbolism changes, if there are common patterns in the dreaming across different women, and looking further down the track, even comparing across cultures, then you can start to create from that research what I'm calling the inner map of pregnancy. So the idea there would be that at different stages of different weeks of the gestation, you'd be able to say the typical pattern is that a woman at this stage would be experiencing this kind of symbolism or that kind of symbolism. Now the therapeutic benefit I would like to suggest that this can produce is, for example, if around, say for example, breastfeeding, So that's an area which can be quite traumatic for many new mothers, whether it succeeds or fails, and the expectations of the mother going into that, and am I a good mother if I'm breastfeeding or not, all those kinds of issues. Whereas if you look back earlier in the pregnancy, when you get the breast size enlarging, what I would suggest is you'd have dreams around that breastfeeding motif within the dreams, and if those dreams show a kind of disconnect between the ego of the mother and those kind of maternal instinct, if you want to call it that, which in Jungian terms would be the mother archetype. And so if there's some kind of disjuncture or lack of connection in the dreams, then at that early stage in the pregnancy, you can start to have some sort of emotional and therapeutic intervention to try and help the ego to fit into that pattern. And so avoid all the trauma and so forth that can happen once the baby is actually born. So the therapeutic value is that by looking in the dreams, you can preempt problems that may occur later and help to fix them before they actually become, or fix them internally before they become problems externally. So that's sort of one example, but I think it could apply to other aspects of the pregnancy process as well. So the therapeutic value, I think, can be quite great, because it could be a corporeal and emotional thing, or it could be purely a medical diagnosis, which may come up through the dream symbolisms, because the tendency can be for problems to arise in the dreams first before they actually become manifest in a way that can be detected medically otherwise. And there's a number of cases in the literature two cases in the literature of Jung making medical diagnoses for dreams. One of those is in the British Medical Journal. I've got a reference for anyone who's interested. And in that case, he didn't even meet the patient. It was another doctor's patient, but he made a correct medical diagnosis from the dream symbolism. So I think there are definitely therapeutic advantages that can come from this inner map once it's actually put on a solid enough comparative basis, comparing between a great enough number of women. So that's the, if you like, the therapeutic value, or the social value or emotional value that can come from that. So moving from what could be potentially a lose-lose situation, with the mother being traumatised by not being able to breastfeed and the baby presumably being equally traumatised. Make a guess, can we? And then to a win-win situation if you can allow the ego of the mother to fit in with that mother archetype, or that pattern of behaviour. So I think that would occur at two places. One would be with the breast enlargement earlier in pregnancy, and then at the actual letdown, where from a hormonal side you've got a huge oxytocin surge coming through there. So I think that's one example of the kind of therapeutic value I think it can have. And that actually brings to a close part one of the paper. So, so it's fairly short and sweet. Hopefully, try to make a lose-lose into a win-win. But if there's any questions at that stage, no, getting a few no's, alrighty.
Yeah,
2 no's.
I've got a few notes. That's interesting. So you're going to test this hypothesis?
Well, that's not a strict test. It's more like a, I suppose, comparative test. But what the aim of this part is basically working on the assumption that that pattern will be there. Yeah. Trying to sort of tease out what are the common elements across a number of women, because you won't get the same or exact same symbolism, but my suggestion is you'll get the same kind of themes. And so what are those themes at each week of gestation and each stage of the pregnancy, breastfeeding, weaning and so forth. And if that pattern can be brought out as a kind of typical pattern, that's the hypothesis. So if that pattern can be brought out, then I think it can have that kind of therapeutic value. So that's by no means, that's purely qualitative research. There's nothing quantitative or necessarily empirical in the strong sense in there. But that kind of strong or strict empirical proof is the aim of the next part of the paper. So here we are now at part 2. So for this part, the aim is putting Jungian psychology on a empirical or medical or scientific basis. So it's quite different from the first half, which is purely qualitative. So here we're moving to something or a research program which is half qualitative and half quantitative. Now I'm calling that the dual perspective. So the idea there is it's looking from the inside and from the outside at the same time. So the view from within, if you like, is via the dream symbolism, and the view from without is your standard quantitative empirical measurement. So you're trying to unite those two perspectives, and your rationale for doing so is the Jungian hypothesis that instinct equals archetype. So the idea that you'll have some physical changes, and you should also have, or that's a hypothesis, you'll also have dream symbolism changes that accompany or that mirror that outer change. So it's not a causal hypothesis, it's simply one of mirroring. And I think that's an important point to make, because the kind of causal hypothesis, causal proof that might be possible would be something along the lines of when someone is dreaming a particular kind of dream symbol, you would have certain neurological firings in the brain and so on and so forth. And I'm by no means an expert on that area, but I imagine that's still quite a way off. We may get there one day, who knows. So what I'm proposing is an acausal method of proof, which is not, while it is scientifically respectable, it's not the usual kind of empirical proof that we're perhaps used to.